When considering the politics of capitalism and schizophrenia, it is essential, first of all, to state one's own critical and political presuppositions, given on the one hand the significant lapse of time that has passed since the completion of the diptych, and on the other, the controversies that have accompanied its reception among political thinkers and philosophers. In the following pages, I will argue that Gilles Deleuze and Félix Guattari were the proponent of an ethico-political stance that can not only withstand many of the criticisms leveled against it, but is actually still extremely useful when we want to understand the political dilemmas of today. In particular, their work will help me proposing a notion of the anthropos as human being that, while always historically and ideologically constituted, can be thought as a dynamic figure of subjectivity for the human. The anthropos, defined as the psychosocial subject of the schizoanalytic process, can help us form a better understanding not only of capital's current grip on global forms of life, but also of the limits of such hold and the spaces that are left for anthropolitical projects of liberation and intervention. The term anthropolitics is being proposed as a critical tool emerging mostly from a reconsideration of the status of ethnoanthropology in Anti-Oedipus and A Thousand Plateaus. These two volumes prefigure a new understanding of political materialism that both preserves and innovates on the Marxist legacy. The intricacy of the diptych multiple references, ranging from biology to psychoanalysis to literature and, in fact, ethnoanthropology, makes of this work an intervention that even now, over 30 years later, is bound to leave its readers bewildered, while at the same time inspiring strong declarations either of allegiance or of rejection. My argument will proceed along three main axes. My first contention will be that too early and highly negative critical reactions by leading post-colonial scholars cast a long shadow on the later reception of the diptych and of its conceptual and political import. Secondly, I will also argue that some contemporary thinkers who claim that the political thought of Gilles Deleuze is either inconsistent or straight out conservative, and that the work that he did with Félix Guattari is incoherent at best and deluded at worst, can be better challenged from the point of view of the anthropolitical perspective that I will be defining here. Thirdly, I will briefly address the co-presence of a diachronic and synchronic perspective on different forms of socio-political organization in the two volumes, and how the privileging of one dimension over the other has, up to now, led to contradictory statements about Deleuze and Guattari's political views. The recent comments by the contemporary Brazilian anthropologist Eduardo Viveiros de Castro on the legacy of the late Pierre Clastres, both in the field of anthropology and of political philosophy, will then start to illuminate the fundamental role that Clastres played in the appearance of ethnoanthropology among the archival and conceptual references for capitalism and schizophrenia. I will conclude that it is only from the point of view of the materiality of the human relation to the earth that the social and political thesis of capitalism and schizophrenia can be best brought back in the contemporary arena. In this respect, I will also briefly address the different definitions of materialism recently given most notably by Alain Badiou and some of his followers. and other lesser-known contemporary thinkers. These definitions are clearly at odds with the ones presented by Deleuze and Guattari, and I believe that in this discrepancy it is contained one of the most challenging alternatives facing the contemporary effort to think political subjectivity in the 21st century. In contrast with the post-Lacanian and ultimately self-referential subjectivities described by Badiou, Zizek, and others, I will argue that Deleuze and Guattari's outwardly directed critical stance paradoxically makes them more contemporary than their younger critics, as they at least try to map a world exterior to Western forms of life. The cartographic, spatial nature of Deleuze and Guattari's thought has recently been underlined by several critics. Tom Conley, commenting on Deleuze's acknowledged fondness for maps, has explicitly remarked that already in and by itself, cartography is a political, spatial form of writing. On the other hand, Janelle Watson has recently said that, and I quote, Guattari's diagrams map an ontology oriented towards the future, replacing lack, that he finds in Lacan, and negation, traditionally bound to Hegel, with the virtual and the possible, end of quotes. Watson also reminds us the vital importance that linguistics, ethology, and semiotics played in Guattari's thought. It is important that these two critical perspectives, one on Deleuze and the other on Guattari, be brought together in the recognition that what is proposed to us in Capitalism and Schizophrenia is not only a virtual plane of conceptual realization, but also a mapping of actual, historically embodied, worldly relations. The first part is entitled Misapprehensions, a Traumatic Postcolonial Reception. I have become increasingly convinced that too early negative responses coming from the field of postcolonial studies have acted as a powerful deterrent to any further investigation into the sources for capitalism and schizophrenia. I'm talking, of course, about Gayatri Spivak's scathing Can the Subaltern Speak?, which appeared in its most complete form in 1988, and Chris Miller's 1993 The Post-Identitarian Predicament in the Footnotes of 1,000 Plateaus, Nomadology, Anthropology, and Authority. Although it might seem superfluous to go back to such early and limited interventions, I think that averting our gaze from the dismissal of Deleuze and Guattari's project, operated by these two different scholars, only encourages and kind of perpetuates a kind of misapprehension that will keep precluding the reception of the diptych's political message. Starting in the 1990s, there have been several studies and edited volumes dedicated to the social and political orientations contained in Deleuze's work, or less often in Deleuze's works with Guattari. However, in this configuration, the constitutive relation between Deleuze and Guattari's materialism and the empirical world of social relations remains ambiguous. Precisely, I argue, because nobody has wanted to explicitly address the legacy of Spivak's and Miller's critiques. Spivak's essay was already written before the English publication of 1,000 Plateaus, and therefore it's not surprising that it should found its arguments mainly on a very summary reading of Anti-Oedipus and a 10-page dialogue between Deleuze and Foucault. The inability of, and I quote, French activist philosophers of history to recognize the other as subject of knowledge is at the center of Spivak's rejection of Michel Foucault and Gilles Deleuze's ethico-political thesis. Even as they try to unshackle desire from its psychoanalytic bonds, what Deleuze and Guattari fail to do is to properly rethink the situation of the desiring subject that they describe in their work. This is still, in Spivak words, and I quote, "The legal subject of socialized capital, neither labor nor management, holding a strong passport, using a strong or hard currency, with supposedly unquestioned access to due process." End of quote. For all their being prophets of heterogeneity and the other, even Deleuze and Guattari are indifferent to ideology, which makes them unable to recognize their own role in perpetuating the epistemic privilege of the Western intellectual. I will quote now Spivak to some length. "It is not only that everything that French intellectuals read, critical or uncritical, is caught within the debate of the production of that other supporting or critiquing the constitution of the subject as Europe. It is also that in the constitution of that other of Europe, great care was taken to obliterate the textual ingredients with which such a subject could connect or occupy its own itinerary, not only by ideological and scientific production, but also by the institution of law." This is the end of quote. More specifically, Spivak denounces the tendency that she sees in Michel Foucault to ignore colonial and post-colonial subjects, especially but not only women and sub-proletarians, and keep reiterating several times that, I quote, "the other as subject is inaccessible to Foucault and Deleuze." Spivak, though, completely ignores the construction of the schizoanalytic image of the unconscious that is central to the definition of subjectivity at work in Deleuze and Guattari's Anti-Oedipus. She just never goes into that. So faced with Spivak's abject rejection, the reader of Anti-Oedipus should say, at the very least, that this critique is severely limited, as it doesn't take into any consideration the presence of ethno-anthropological literature in Anti-Oedipus, not even to dismiss it. Spivak, in fact, reads critically only the short dialogue between Foucault and Deleuze, and just enlarges her critique to the text produced by Deleuze and Guattari. She did say that when assessing the relation of the Western intellectual with its non-Western other, one should always get into a critique, and I quote, "of disciplinary anthropology." But then why doesn't she address its presence, at least in Anti-Oedipus? It is clearly from an a priori position that while reiterating that Deleuze ignores, and I quote, "the epistemic violence of imperialism," Spivak thinks that concepts like desire and power de-economicize and therefore depoliticize both Deleuze and Foucault's approach to third world politics. This is not the place to talk about Foucault, but one wonders why Spivak did not bother to comment either on Deleuze and Guattari's critique of capitalism as the horizon of all economic systems in Anti-Oedipus, or in their description of alternate modes of production and social organization in that book. It plainly isn't true that the unconscious appearing in Anti-Oedipus is an alternate mode of, and I quote, "the pure form of consciousness that constitutes the idealistic bedrock of what Spivak calls internationalist Marxism." I would not have taken the time to address, however briefly, Spivak's essay if I wasn't convinced that even such a summary and, to to a certain extent, prejudiced dismissal carries consequences to this day. I think, for instance, that Spivak's piece encouraged Chris Miller just a few years later to levy his own accusations against Deleuze and Guattari's politics, as I will now try to explain. There is one Deleuzian scholar who has acknowledged from the very beginning Chris Miller's critique of the anthropological materials contained in one essay of A Thousand Plateaus. That is Paul Patton, who reluctantly confesses that Miller found that Deleuze and Guattari's use of field studies when proposing their concept of nomadology was dubious. However, Patton did not engage in debunking Miller's arguments, deciding instead that, and I quote, the appropriate response to Miller's accusations is to abandon such material and look for other ways to specify the concept. End of quote. The specific points on which Miller based this critique are not mentioned at all. Patton prefers assigning nomadology to a pure field of socio-political virtualities, but in so doing he ends up proposing an image of Deleuzian materialism that is at least partial, if not inadequate. Chris Miller's critique of the use of ethno-anthropological materials in A Thousand Plateaus and the way in which Deleuzian scholars read them rests on two main assertions. And on the first one, I will say right away that he's absolutely right. Contrary to what some Deleuzian scholars seem to think, and I quote Miller, the epistemology of nomad thought is not simply self-referential within a set of given definitions, but depends on a referential descriptive archive in which anthropology and ethnography play an essential role. Furthermore, Miller correctly states that, and I quote again, the human has not disappeared from Deleuze and Guattari's text, even if humanism and anthropocentrism have been rejected by the two authors. This is also my argument. However, it is in the valuation of the anthropological sources for capitalism and schizophrenia that Miller's critique shows both its factual limits and its critical blindness. In a way quite similar to Gayatri Spivak's, Miller's ultimate intent is to show that Deleuze and Guattari's description and theorization of primitive modes of societal organization is still dependent on the colonial project of, and I quote, knowing by controlling, or rather, controlling by knowing. The pitfalls of such projects cast a long shadow on their ideas. Not only do the French philosophers make a blatant mistake when in one of their footnotes they mix up the African nation of Guinea with the New Guinea that lies in the South American continent, but they made use of ethnological and anthropological sources that were either shaky or ideologically tainted, and sometimes both. The first fact is true and cannot be contested, but assuming that what might have been a simple editorial oversight was in fact a true Freudian slip, revealing a neo-colonial disregard for all cultural specificity, is a further step that would need to be textually justified, and Miller never does that. But with respect to the sources for the chapter on nomadology in A Thousand Plateaus, Miller says that Deleuze and Guattari's suggest nothing like the wholesale discrediting of the anthropological discipline that can be discerned, for example, in Derrida's grammatology, and Miller also says that A Thousand Plateaus is full of anthropological sources, and it generates an anthropological discourse of its own. Once again, I'm in full agreement with Miller. But then, why does he decide to completely ignore the references to major anthropologists? Miller mentions Salins, Dumézil, and Clastres, among others, and simply denounced the presence of minor footnote references, such as Pierre-Ernest José, who was in fact a colonial administrator of the Belgian Congo and whose book on the secret societies of the leopard man might in fact have played a part in shaping the concept of becoming animal. Another controversial footnote reference is Pierre Hubac, who in his 1948 book Les Nomades practiced, according to Miller, and I quote, an anthropology that is more about the author's personal vision of social ethics, using the other as pretext, than about the other itself. End of quote. We should notice that what bothers Miller is not the fact that José was a colonial administrator, since he himself states in a surprisingly cynical way that, and I quote, the fox is more qualified than anyone to report on the social structure of the hen house, end of quote. Nor does he really object to Hubac's representation of the importance of war in nomadic societies. What Miller can't accept is simply that Deleuze and Guattari want to include a representational and necessarily limited archive taken from psychology, sociology, biology, ethnoanthropology, into a supposedly pure concept that would be nomadism. This is why the French philosophers are accused not only of primitivism, but, for instance, of glossing over the violence of the practices described in the anthropological literature about certain nomadic groups. Deleuze and Guattari don't seem to understand or acknowledge that people actually die in certain African rituals, or that, and I quote Miller, the nomad war machine actually kills people. Miller doesn't say that the whole project of 1,000 Plateaux is discredited on the basis of the weakness of its reference corpus. But for him, the stakes are different, in fact, because he wants to push his own critical agenda, a moderate, and I quote Miller, positive cosmopolitanism of knowledge that would face up to the consequences of the representational authority it assumes. End of quote. So I have already said that I agree with Miller when he says that there is a strong representational and archive-based content in 1,000 Plateaus, and also in Anti-Oedipus, and that it is a mistake on the part of some Deleuzians to deny its constitutive import for Deleuze and Guattari's philosophical project. But the problem is that in an anti-theoretical move that he shares with many others, Miller is completely unwilling to admit that an ethico-political philosophy can in fact strive to combine knowledge, as he defines it, and theoretical ambition. In his critique, not only does Miller completely ignore the reflection about primitive societies contained in Anti-Oedipus, but also the importance of capitalist pressures and therefore colonialist histories for the very populations that he wants to defend from the ethnocentric grasp of French thought. Whatever that is, actually. The project of a political or even philosophical anthropology is just anathema to him. But now, in the pages that follow, I will try to reverse both Spivak's and Miller's critique, arguing that the anthropos described by Deleuze and Guattari in Capitalism and Schizophrenia is neither the unmarked and self-referential man of Western modernity, nor its much invoked but irreparably orientalized other. To a certain extent, what could be at the root of this kind of critical misunderstanding might be the project of producing not only a universal history of human oppression, which would reveal itself not only in the ideology of the anthropological discipline, but of philosophy maybe itself, but also a generalized model of political philosophy. It is from this perspective that I will argue that the reception for Deleuze and Guattari anthropolitical thesis is still far from being achieved. So this is the second part of my talk, which is called From Universal History to Anthropological Synchronicity. It is well known that already at the end of the 19th century, the horizontal, eminently synchronic approach of linguistics and a little later ethnoanthropology to social organization represented a serious challenge to the historicism dominating the humanities in that particular moment. History, of course, is only one of the many discursive modes present in Deleuze and Guattari's immensely eclectic diptych, and it cannot be considered the dominant one. It is true, of course, that different incarnations of social structures and artistic expression are dated in 1,000 plateaus, and that in chapter 3 of Anti-Oedipus, we see an overt reprisal of 18th and 19th century discourses of universal history, from Giambattista Vico to Karl Marx. In this regard, J. Lampert's book on Deleuze's philosophy of history is an essential tool in understanding some of the mechanisms of historical representation present in the book that Deleuze co-authored with Guattari. In particular, Lampert is absolutely right in reminding us that we are faced here with a history without succession, relying on the essential experience of coexistence and simultaneity, which means that for Deleuze, and I quote Lampert, the past is a real place in the body. Similarly, the references to the Nietzschean every name in history is I is indeed essential to understand the impulse toward tracing a simultaneous plane both for subjective constitution and for theoretical reflection. But Lampert, while obviously acknowledging the presence of empirical data in capitalism and schizophrenia, simply mentions once again that Chris Miller had judged their corpus about nomadic societies empirically inaccurate. So Lampert repeats a critique that was flawed without debunking it, probably just because he wanted to avert his gaze from Deleuze and Guattari's supposedly ethnocentric stance. Lampert focuses instead on the temporal structure of chapter 3 of Anti-Oedipus, giving a reading of the three anthropoi described as savages, barbarians, and civilized men that maintains simultaneity simply at the level of internal historical consciousness for any one subject living in the present, but completely ignoring the issue of the geospatial distribution of different ways of life actually unfolding at the same time on different parts of the earth. In other words, the subjective availability of any moment in history, and Lampert only uses examples from Western history, is given preference over the gathering of information on different socio-political ways of organizing the anthropos' physical and mental spaces. In the context of the present discussion, we really should not forget that the philosophy of history has always had a peculiar relation with its own object of study, as it has included in practice, but excluded in theory, what have long been called societies without history. In other words, so-called primitive societies have been defined from the standpoint of a certain conception of time and historicity, internal to history itself. Being without history and defined by it in the very concept of primitivism, entire ways of life found itself in a position that is both politically subordinate and conceptually weak. Of course, this simultaneous inclusion-exclusion has been the object of much debate in post-colonial contexts, and this also represents the core of the criticism levied against French thought in general, and then Deleuze and Guattari sort of by extension, as I discussed in the previous section. However, I believe that a more sustained consideration of this paradox should give a much more immediately political content to Lampert's affirmation that in Deleuze and Guattari, and I quote, "History is not the past, but the circulation of events." In Capitalism and Schizophrenia, that circulation happens among the extremely different presence existing on the Earth's surface at different times of the planet's life, and not only in the paranoid delirium of Western philosophers. So the impulse towards composing a universal history in the tradition of Western philosophy can obfuscate the equally important necessity to assert the absolute coexistence of different forms of social organization, and that kind of simultaneity is documented by the field sciences. The political question, why now, and more explicitly, why state capitalism now, can only be addressed by Deleuze and Guattari on a vast synchronic surface of actual or virtual realizations of economic and political possibilities. The historical dimension of that question does not fully account for the fact that only by assessing the coexistence of different presence can we start questioning any univocal understanding of the past. The recourse to ethnoanthropology on the part of Deleuze and Guattari can also be overshadowed by other common approaches to their thought. On the one hand, systems theory, with its emphasis on the Deleuzian notions of assemblages and virtualities, and on the other, modern political philosophy, from Hobbes to Carl Schmitt, with its reliance on notions such as sovereignty, representation, and state security. Reading Deleuzian social and political thought through the lens of system theory is of course amply justified. It's clear that theses of autopoiesis and equilibrium extended to the social plane from fields such as thermodynamics, molecular biology, and cybernetics were in fact essential to the vocabulary of Anti-Oedipus. However, the general question of the status of the experimental sciences in Capitalism and Schizophrenia is interesting insofar as it alerts us to the kind of knowledge contained in these books and the method adopted in order to use it. Certainly, only a willful rejection of empirical disciplines as such could have led Patton to say a little later than his intervention about ethnoanthropology that, and I quote Patton, "the value of this philosophy of multiplicities lies less in the field of empirical social analysis than in that of practical reason. End of quote. But in fact, just a look at the densely populated footnotes of the two volumes tells us that the opposite is true. It is doubtful that without the input of empiric social analysis, being psychiatric practice and theory, cultural geography, ethno-anthropological field studies, biology, the very concept of the socius could have been elaborated, while nowhere in Capitalism and Schizophrenia can one find the textual traces of anything, any concept resembling Kantian practical reason. On the other hand, the political import of the discussion of the domination of capital in socio-economic relations, which is the project of Anti-Oedipus, cannot be overstated. That a stern critic like Peter Hallward, who himself is intent at constructing an interventionist, even prescriptive image of political theory, should accuse Deleuze of utopian distraction, cannot surprise us excessively. For Hallward, all those who continue to devote energy and ingenuity to the task of proposing a Deleuzian version of political philosophy are either in bad faith or simply naive. In this respect, the intervention of Éric Aliès in the controversy around Alain Badiou's 1996 Deleuze, The Clamor of Being, remains essential. On the one hand, Aliès stressed the fundamental importance of the encounter with the practicing schizoanalyst and political activist Félix Guattari in the elaboration of Deleuze's own thought. And on the other, he overtly took issue with Badiou's claim that Deleuze does not attribute any place to politics as such, since he does not consider it a form of truth creation. This is not the place to discuss Badiou's conceptualization of processes of truth and how they differ from the creation of planes of immanence attributed to philosophy, art, and sciences by the authors of What is Philosophy? But I will say that to acknowledge that for Deleuze and Guattari politics is not a process of truth doesn't in any way imply that politics is not a fundamental part of their philosophical reflection. Aliès' commitment to Deleuze's statement that Anti-Oedipus was, and I quote Deleuze, from beginning to end a book of political philosophy, end of quote, was then an essential step in the right direction. Additionally, against Badiou's claim that Deleuzian desire simply amounts to the expression of marketable individualities, Aliès points out that in Anti-Oedipus we find a way to understand the constructivism of desire by subordinating the claim to equality to the politics of difference. Far from being the ideologist of late capitalism, as Zizek said in 2004, Deleuze and Guattari use all sorts of materials to make us understand that while capitalism is indeed always on the horizon of every social organization as a threat, it doesn't exhaust it, either extensively or intensively. In fact, it is the multiplication of worlds that the political and philosophical recasting of the ethno-anthropological disciplines can open for us. Modern political philosophy, I will argue, has rarely conceived of itself in this way, as it relies on the definitions of already accepted institutions, such as the state, as the proper object of its study. To put it in the vocabulary of Capitalism and Schizophrenia, this is political philosophy in its instantiation as a royal science. That would be a knowledge that filters and instrumentalizes the anthropoid's experimentations in social living. But what would it take for political philosophy to become an ambulatory science, based on observation and not prescription? Could this be the shift in approach that Deleuze and Guattari's were encouraging us to embrace? So I go now into my next section that is called Political Materialism, from Anthropology to Anthropolitics. In this context, anthropology, and even more its less dignified compilatory sister, ethnography, could be drastically reclaimed from their post-colonial detractors. Born as the scion and accomplice, maybe, of the colonialist project of knowing by controlling, these inquiries became, as all philosophical and scientific projects, the bearers of a plane of immanence irreducible to its originary intent. In fact, I will argue that they could be the perfect example of what Deleuze and Guattari defined as ambulatory sciences. Both Eugene Holland and Manuel de Landa have underlined the importance of this perspective in Deleuze and Guattari's work. But not unexpectedly, it is a contemporary Brazilian anthropologist, Eduardo Viveiros de Castro, who in his recent introduction to a new English edition of Pierre Clastres' classic Archaeology of Violence, seems to have stated the import of the anthropological component in Deleuze and Guattari's political thought in the best possible way, and I quote Viveiros de Castro. There indeed exists a quite characteristic way of being of what Clastres called primitive society. This way of being is essentially a politics of multiplicity. The politics of multiplicity is a mode of becoming rather than a way of being, and it is effectively instituted or institutionalized in certain ethno-historical contexts, but does not depend on a transition to a molar state to function. Quite the opposite. End of quote. And Viveiros de Castro also gives a very good assessment of the political philosophy that emerges in the two volumes of Capitalism and Schizophrenia, and I quote Viveiros de Castro again. The molecular dissemination of subjective agency throughout the universe, in testifying to the inexistence of a transcendent cosmological point of view, obviously correlates with the inexistence of a unifying political point of view that would gather unto itself the principle of humanity and sociality. This is essential to my argument, because in the last 2 decades, several French philosophers have spent a lot of intellectual energy in the distillation of a principle of humanity and sociality that would allow us to conceive of the political as something that would explain every truly political instantiation, and this is really fundamental. Equality in Jacques Rancière, equal liberty in Etienne Balibar, truth and the event in Badiou. These transhistorical, non-culture specific understandings of political subjectivity can certainly be useful, but I argue that they can generally just be rhetorical tools that can be retrieved in the context of localized political struggles within the context of globalized Western modernity. However, they all harken back to a certain conception of social participation that forces us to all sorts of intellectual contortions in never-ending controversies about, for instance, the universal value of categories essential to the functioning of our forms of government, such as secularism, democratic representation, and the like. But I think that another thought is not only possible but necessary. If we recognize the importance of field studies for the constitution of the socio-political content of Anti-Oedipus, we will see that we need to purloin the very notion of materialism from the history of Western philosophy and reattach it to matter itself. That is, to the anthropos, defined as the singularity populating one of the material phyla described in Thousand Plateaus. The ambulatory sciences are attached to matter, in fact to all matters that cross their path, human bodies included. In order to understand the relation between the human animal and the earth as shared by the physical and psychological phylum that I call the anthropos, we might not want to take the shortcut of what we already know, the philosophies of materialism, and I quote Rosi Braidotti from the 18th century to Deleuze. But if we want to create a new understanding of sociality and politics, we will have to venture into what we don't know and we have not created. And this is where field sciences such as physics, biology, or ethnoanthropology become essential to philosophical reflection. The fact that the data used are always dependent on the ideological limitations of its practitioners, as Spivak and Miller pointed out, doesn't have to be an excuse to permanently foreclose this kind of practice. As Rosi Braidotti said, it is by looking elsewhere that we can try to, and I quote Braidotti, to rethink continuities between the subject and his or her own context without reference to holistic worldviews. End of quote. So, when we try to understand what is the political value of Deleuze and Guattari's thought, we shouldn't be looking for a utopia of deterritorialized spaces, because the question for Deleuze and Guattari has never been, as Lampert has formulated it, how does absolute deterritorialization allow for history at all? End of quote. Absolute deterritorialization is neither a historical nor a geopolitical form of life. There are only past, present, and future instances of territorial and then deterritorialized becomings. The transverse temporality of actual events, and therefore the availability of political difference, is to be mapped on the finitude of the earth, as well as on the infinite dimensions of time. I want to address briefly another obstacle to the proper reception of the import of ethnoanthropology in capitalism and schizophrenia, which is the structuralist label that is still commonly attached to French anthropology. In her article on Lévi-Strauss, Deleuze, and the Joy of Abstraction, Eleanor Kaufman states that abstraction in Deleuze is, and I quote, the hinge point between Claude Lévi-Strauss' structuralism and Deleuze's post-structuralism. End of quote. It is telling from the point of view of this essay that Kaufman completely ignores the very discipline on which Lévi-Strauss built his reputation, that is anthropology and ethnographic research. Lévi-Strauss is only considered in his discussion of Prop, Vladimir Prop, and Russian formalism, and Deleuze is only read in his analysis of the series in logic of sense and of repetition in Proust and science. That is a paradox, that an anthropologist would be considered to be the inspiration of sort of a structural source for Deleuze when, in fact, the discipline is completely ignored. But as Viveros de Castros reminds us, the most prevalent anthropological reference for Deleuze and Guattari is not Lévi-Strauss, but his student, Pierre Clastres. In the field of paleoanthropology, Deleuze and Guattari also rely very heavily on Georges Dumézil and André Leroi-Gourhan, who are essential to the conceptualization of the historical perspective on different forms of society in 1,000 Plateaus. None of these thinkers follow the structuralist path, either when they study social organization, which is Clastres, myth, that would be Dumézil, or technology, as anthropogenesis, which is the contribution of Leroi-Gourhan. However, all of them specifically tie cultural and technological practices to the social and political organization of human populations and to their mode of constituting power structures and institutions. For the rest of this paper, I will restrict my attention to the presence of Pierre Clastres in Anti-Oedipus, since I believe that his understanding of society and power is essential to the work of Deleuze and Guattari. The fact that Clastres himself attended Deleuze's seminars in Vincennes in the 1970s before his premature death in a car accident in 1978 can only confirm the depth of this conceptual and political relation. It is significant that Pierre Clastres' work have recently been republished in English in the context of a renewal of interest in radical forms of political critique of the capitalist world order. Both Society Against the State, first published in 1974, translated the first time in 1987, and now re-edited in 2007, and Archaeology of Violence, first published posthumous in 1980 in French, and now recently retranslated by Semiotext in 2010, are an attempt to approach what Clastres calls savage societies from a point of view that sees in primitivism not a chronological notion, but a socio-political strategy. The stateless territorial societies that Deleuze and Guattari describe in Anti-Oedipus do possess an operative political life that the Western observer doesn't recognize because of his or her own entrenchment in a political world entirely based on institutions tied to state sovereignty. In the essay entitled Power in Primitive Societies, Clastres stated, "Taking primitive societies seriously comes down to this proposition, which in fact defines them perfectly. A distinct political sphere cannot be isolated from the social sphere." End of quote. This simple proposition is in fact extremely controversial from the point of view of political philosophy. How, in fact, can we recognize the presence of what we call politics in societies where sometimes even chieftainship is located outside the exercise of political power? What kind of politics is possible when the issue of sovereignty is constantly eschewed because power is not incarnated in a separate body, be it the king despot or the modern republic, but constantly reattached to the social body itself? Pierre Clastres documents numerous anthropological examples of this kind of society in different populations of Amerindians, from the Guayaki Indians of Paraguay to the Yanomami tribes of Brazil. According to own field research and ethnographic materials that he takes from others. In these groups, the non-presence of any administration of political power resembling a state is not a sign of primitivism, but the result of a conscious social choice. Territorial societies physically and symbolically code their own participants in a way that determines their place in private and public life. This kind of social group designates chiefs who lead the men into war and solve private conflicts, and shamans for the public display of spiritual practices and beliefs. But they have very limited powers of coercion, and there is no sovereignty at all. Essentially, the chief represents the social body in its festivals and encounters with other societies, and is compensated for this responsibility with limited social privileges, such as polygamy, for instance. As we could expect, Clastres is also engaged in an anti-Marxist approach to the issue of the economic functioning of primitive societies. In his view, Marxist anthropology fails to recognize that it is not the economic relations that determines political superstructures, but vice versa. It is precisely because the primitive societies refuses the alienation of power that it also prevents the accumulation of wealth on the part of one or more of its members. Clearly influenced by Marshall Sahlins' Stone Age Economics that had come out in 1974, Clastres rejects the idea that primitive society is plagued by scarcity and therefore simply can't understand the concept of surplus wealth. Sahlins' research into the economic organization of hunter-gatherer societies convinced him that only a prejudiced view of human wants and needs can paint primitive societies as plagued by lack. On the contrary, these ways of life correspond to a specific techno-political accommodation, even if, and I quote Sahlins, bourgeois ethnocentrism, end of quote, precludes us from recognizing it. If, therefore, in savage societies, which in anti-Oedipus parlance would be non-despotic and non-civilized, the political sphere is unrecognizable to the Western onlooker, it's simply because the political function, that is, the public exertion of power, has been retained by the social body itself. Another important part of Clastres' research is the foundational role that war plays in organizing a population's internal organization and external practices. In primitive societies, war defines the community. Among other things, it becomes one of the most common ways of reiterating the all-important gender dichotomy. Violence is also, of course, a common and accepted social manifestation, but within strictly coded and limited limits and rituals. War is one of the many ways that the savage anthropos deals not only with the common phenomenon of death, but also with the necessity of confronting socio-cultural exteriorities. In this respect, violence and war are the price to pay in the constant reaffirmation of agency and autonomy. In Sorrows of a Savage Warrior, one of his essays, Clastres says that, and I quote, warlike violence appears in the savage's universe as the principal means of maintaining this society's non-division, of maintaining each community's autonomy as a single totality, free and independent of others, end of quote. This implies, and I quote again, that if war is a societal attribute, then warlike activity functions as a determining factor of the male being in the world. In primitive society, man is by definition a warrior. End of quote. We have to be careful not to romanticize this kind of social arrangement. The group and not the individual is the agent of such processes. In fact, single members of the society can embrace their coded behaviors with a higher or lesser degree of enthusiasm. Clastres explains, for instance, that the relation between the single warrior and the male community of warriors is far from simple. In certain cases, there is an element of singular desire for war that exceeds societal coding and generates a blind destructiveness that needs to be severely sanctioned by the group. A similar problem can also arise when the appointed chief to the group sometimes desires power for himself in a way that exceeds his purely representational function on behalf of the society itself. This is precisely where class ethnographic and theoretical contributions becomes even more significant. First of all, we need to explicitly recognize that primitive societal coding, as it consciously opposes itself to state domination, does not coincide at all with an ethics of free desire. All societies are highly prescriptive, and Deleuze and Guattari's own politics is also not a politics of free desire. As Janel Watson said, there is in fact no anarchy in Deleuze and Guattari's description of socio-political spaces. Uncoded anarchy simply does not exist on this earth, and certainly does not constitute the telos either of schizoanalysis or what I want to call here anthropolitics. The generic liberation of desire is the promise of capital, but Deleuze and Guattari, far from promoting it, constantly demystify it in their work. They explain how the decoded flows of free workers and money are constantly redistributed by capital along the lines of an unlimited social axiomatic sustained by a state whose role is increasingly to enter, and I quote, into the service of the signs of economic power, end of quote. However, what the anthropological archives presented to Deleuze and Guattari were non-capitalist, non-statist forms of social organization which maintained their autonomy with respect to the alienation of power typical of despotic and modern capitalist states. Their struggles against exploitation within the different national frameworks of the Western colonial project and its ethnocidal policies should not prevent us from recognizing that, and I quote De Castro, the molecular dissemination of subjective agency throughout the universe testifies to the inexistence of a transcendent cosmological point of view or a unifying political point of view. Already in the 1990s, the French anthropologist Marc Augé had clearly stated that anthropology could in fact be reborn around the project of ending the confusion between multiplicity and otherness, allowing us to think the conditions for an effective, lived contemporaneity. If indeed it's true that through the anthropos' ability to create a surplus of wealth, capital haunts all forms of societies, it is also true that it doesn't constitute the society's essence, nor its desire. If anthropology tells us anything, is that desire is always socially distributed and attributed to a machinic body without organs, the socius. However, anthropology also teaches us that singular actualizations of the socius can be contingently modulated. In terms of gender politics, for instance, Clastres observed that although war does in fact define masculinity, not all male social actors will want to be part, for instance, of much more competitive warrior clans. I mean, it's like not all men today need to be part of a football team, it's kind of the same thing. In fact, the desire for that sort of ultra masculinity is often subordinated to the desire for life normally associated with women. Territorial societies, in other words, although they might seem very rigid, mostly when they're described by structuralist anthropologists, are perfectly able to moderate and modify their own need for coding the social flows. The utopia of desire, however, it is not situated in Deleuze and Guattari's anthropolitical analysis, but is in fact capital's ruse, which consists precisely in making us believe that its own deterritorialized money flows are synonymous with freedom. In fact, Deleuze's fundamental stoicism and Guattari's schizoanalytic sobrieties have always prevented them from ever landing into utopian territory. Micropolitics is situated in the lands and spaces of social organization. Anthropology is the exact contrary of utopic or universalistic political reflection, providing us with a powerful cartography of the human relation to the earth. In this respect, anthropolitics would provide us with a version of political philosophy that would accept its status as an ambulatory science, interested not in general principles, but in recognizing what, in certain specific sociopolitical arrangements, corresponds to an image of the anthropos that can or cannot appear desirable or effectual to others. This is why I believe that the anthropos of anthropolitics is neither the man of West modernity nor his orientalized other. The anthropos, initially assessed at the limits between Western man and exotic animal, is finally neither of those, and can therefore become an immensely productive intellectual and political category. Whether we, the utterly embedded subjects of global capital, can still draw inspirations from the politics of the savages and nomads populating capitalism and schizophrenia is of course no easy question. I will say though that if capitalism and inequality are the dark side of any social organization, then we can at least cultivate in our social being the savage reflex against the instauration of inequality that is the main characteristic of the capitalist relation to the earth. Today's discourse on globalization is all too often the acceptance of the universality of capitalism and of its dependence on different kinds of state formations that all mimic more or less Western modern models. The short-lived belief in the demise of state power under global capital has by now been fully debunked. Capital will always need the state's overcoding of its own imperatives, although of course it is simply as its own model of realization, an independent worldwide axiomatic that is like a single city of which the states are parts. This is a quote for 1,000 Plateaus. This was like 30 years ago, but things have not changed. Anthropology, at least as practiced by some of its scholars, reminds us that people have always revolted in many different places against such an imposition, and that they have even accepted to engage in perpetual war and in refusing to relinquish sovereignty just in order to maintain the primacy of their social collective models of relating to the earth. Anthropolitics then has to be conceived today as a strategic anti-politics, at least in the sense that has been attributed to it by modern capitalist societies. In that respect, if the ethnographic sciences can still teach us anything, I deem it to be a good lesson. Thank you very much. Of the anthropolitical perspective that I will be defining here. Thirdly, I will briefly address the co-presence of a diachronic and synchronic perspective on different forms of socio-political organization in the two volumes, and how the privileging of one dimension over the other has, up to now, led to contradictory statements about Deleuze and Guattari's political views. The recent comments by the contemporary Brazilian anthropologist Eduardo Viveiros de Castro on the legacy of the late Pierre Clastres, both in the field of anthropology and of political philosophy, will then start to illuminate the fundamental role that Clastres played in the appearance of ethnoanthropology among the archival and conceptual references for capitalism and schizophrenia. I will conclude that it is only from the point of view of the materiality of the human relation to the earth that the social and political thesis of capitalism and schizophrenia can be best brought back in the contemporary arena. In this respect, I will also briefly address the different definitions of materialism recently given most notably by Alain Badiou and some of his followers, and other lesser-known contemporary thinkers. These definitions are clearly at odds with the ones presented by Deleuze and Guattari, and I believe that in this discrepancy when considering the politics of capitalism and schizophrenia, it is essential, first of all, to state one's own critical and political presuppositions, given on the one hand the significant lapse of time that has passed since the completion of the diptych, and on the other, the controversies that have accompanied its reception among political thinkers and philosophers. In the following pages, I will argue that Gilles Deleuze and Félix Guattari were the proponent of an ethico-political stance that can not only withstand many of the criticisms leveled against it, but is actually still extremely useful when we want to understand the political dilemmas of today. In particular, their work will help me proposing a notion of the anthropos as human being that, while always historically and ideologically constituted, can be thought as a dynamic figure of subjectivity for the human. The anthropos, defined as the psychosocial subject of the schizoanalytic process, can help us form a better understanding not only of capital's current grip on global forms of life, but also of the limits of such hold, and the spaces that are left for anthropology and Guattari be brought together in the recognition that what is proposed to us in capitalism and schizophrenia is not only a virtual plane of conceptual realization, but also a mapping of actual, historically embodied, worldly relations. Um, the first part is entitled Misapprehensions, a Traumatic Postcolonial Reception. I have become increasingly convinced that too early negative responses coming from the field of postcolonial studies have acted as a powerful deterrent to any further investigation into the sources for capitalism and schizophrenia. I'm talking, of course, about Gayatri Spivak's scathing Can the Subaltern Speak?, which appeared in its most complete form in 1988, and Chris Miller's 1993 The Post-Identitarian Predicament in the Footnotes of 1,000 Plateaus, Nomadology, Anthropology, and Authority. Although it might seem superfluous to go back to such early and limited interventions, I think that averting our gaze from the dismissal of Deleuze and Guattari's project, operated by these two different scholars, only encourages and kind of perpetuates a kind of misapprehension that will keep precluding the reception of the diptych's political message, political projects of liberation and intervention. The term anthropolitics is being proposed as a critical tool emerging mostly from a reconsideration of the status of ethnoanthropology in Anti-Oedipus and 1,000 Plateaus. These two volumes prefigure a new understanding of political materialism that both preserves and innovates on the Marxist legacy. The intricacy of the diptych multiple references, ranging from biology to psychoanalysis to literature and, in fact, ethnoanthropology, makes of this work an intervention that even now, over 30 years later, is bound to leave its readers bewildered, while at the same time inspiring strong declarations either of allegiance or of rejection. My argument will proceed along three main axes. My first contention will be that too early and highly negative critical reactions by leading postcolonial scholars cast a long shadow on the later reception of the diptych and of its conceptual and political import. Secondly, I will also argue that some contemporary thinkers who claim that the political thought of Gilles Deleuze is either inconsistent or straight out conservative, and that the work that he did with Félix Guattari is incoherent at best and deluded at worst, can be better challenged from the point of view it is contained one of the most challenging alternatives facing the contemporary effort to think political subjectivity in the 21st century. In contrast with the post-Lacanian and ultimately self-referential subjectivities described by Badiou, Zizek, and others, I will argue that Deleuze and Guattari's outwardly directed critical stance paradoxically makes them more contemporary than their younger critics, as they at least try to map a world exterior to Western forms of life. The cartographic, spatial nature of Deleuze and Guattari's thought has recently been underlined by several critics. Tom Conley, commenting on Deleuze's acknowledged fondness for maps, has explicitly remarked that already in and by itself, cartography is a political, spatial form of writing. On the other hand, Janelle Watson has recently said that, and I quote, Guattari's diagrams map an ontology oriented towards the future, replacing lack, that he finds in Lacan, and negation, traditionally bound to Hegel, with the virtual and the possible, end of quotes. Watson also reminds us the vital importance that linguistics, ethology, and semiotics played in Guattari's thought. It is important that these two critical perspectives, one on Deleuze and the other